renewable energy. Joining me today are my colleagues from IREC, Mari Hernandez, Michelle Barrett, Gwen Brown, Midhat Mafazi, and Brian Leidig, and Sky Stanfield with Shoot Mahali and Weinberger. And I'll ask, as each of our speakers today takes the helm on the slides, that you introduce yourselves to the group. The presentation and the training that we're doing today is part of a 3-year project supported by the U.S. Department of Energy's Solar Energy Technologies Office. We would very much like to thank them for their support and acknowledge that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. DOE or the U.S. government. And a little bit about IREC. IREC is focused on building the foundation for the rapid adoption of clean energy and energy efficiency to benefit people, the economy, and our planet. And our role in the project through which we're doing this presentation is as project lead, and I will share with you who our wonderful project partners are in just a minute. Quick overview of the agenda. We are beginning with an overview of the batteries project. We will then launch into the substantive presentation, after which we will go into breakout groups for discussion. This is intended to be an interactive training, and we will close out with Q&A. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat box while we're giving the presentation. We will be addressing questions during the breakout groups rather than as part of the presentation portion. All right, so a little bit about the batteries project to start. Batteries stands for Building a Technically Reliable Interconnection Evolution for Storage. This is a 3-year project intended at reducing the soft costs and time for interconnecting both standalone storage and solar plus storage to the distribution grid. So this is focused on distribution, interconnection of storage, and solar plus storage. The project does not specifically address transmission interconnection. And the soft costs and time reductions are done through developing solutions to a suite of regulatory and technical storage interconnection barriers. The outcome of the batteries project is a nationally applicable toolkit of solutions. We released the toolkit in March of this year, so it is available already for your review. We will be covering some of the solutions in the toolkit as part of this training. However, because this is today intended to be a more broad training on what DER interconnection is, what the challenges with DER interconnection are at a higher level, we will not be going through the full suite of solutions and challenges addressed in the toolkit. The timeframe of the project where we are now is in year 3. This is the first training in a series of 4 workshops and 8 trainings that are going to be happening from today through March of next year. And each of the subsequent trainings is going to delve into one of the barriers addressed in the toolkit. So the subsequent trainings after today are going to be much more intensive, much more in depth. So please keep that in mind as we go through today. Today is a little bit more high level. Subsequent trainings will be much more in depth, and we will provide information on what those subsequent topics will be a little later in today's presentation. And the last thing I'll say about the toolkit is that it is intended to serve as a resource for regulators, utilities, storage developers, and other stakeholders engaged in the interconnection process. And it includes resources such as model interconnection procedure language. It's meant to be a usable resource that stakeholders can tap into in order to update their storage interconnection procedures in their respective states. And here we have the batteries project team. As you can see, it is a multi-partner interdisciplinary team that is intended to reflect diverging viewpoints, folks from different sectors of the clean energy space, in order to make sure we develop a well-rounded suite of storage interconnection solutions that represent the various viewpoints within the industry. And now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Sky Stanfield, for a dive into what is grid interconnection. Sky, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Skye Stanfield. I'm a partner with the law firm Shute Mahali and Weinberger based in San Francisco. And I have been representing IREC in regulatory proceedings related to interconnection for many years now. We've worked on interconnection procedures together in probably 30 or more states at this point. And I'm, as the lawyer in the group and not the engineer, I'm going to focus this presentation on sort of the basics of what the interconnection process is, what its functions are, and how it's evolving. Next slide, please. So the first thing to keep in mind is that an interconnection agreement is one of the three core pillars of any clean energy project. In addition to needing to identify and secure a project location, obtain financing, and navigate the local land use and building permits process, virtually every project must obtain an interconnection agreement. I think of this as a three-legged stool. Without any one of these, a project will topple. The only projects that do not require an interconnection agreement are those that are fully isolated from the grid. And those are very uncommon. This means that even projects that are not exporting to the grid, in other words, they don't plan to send power onto the grid, typically must still go through an interconnection process. In the past, interconnection has not received quite the same attention as some of the other legs of the stool, but it's increasingly being seen as the most difficult and crucial aspect for many projects. Perhaps this is because there are more market opportunities, improvements in financing and permitting guidelines, but I think that there are really two core reasons why interconnection is becoming such a critical bottleneck. The first is that we're sort of a victim of our own success. Interconnection becomes more and more difficult the more generation you have on the distribution system. And the process is slower and more difficult to navigate when there are many more projects in queue at the same time. The second is that the interconnection process, and indeed the distribution grid itself, was not designed with the current realities in mind, and frankly hasn't evolved all that much despite rapid changes in DR technologies and growing interest in their deployment. It's sort of like we're trying to use dial-up internet to stream Netflix when it comes to the interconnection process. Next slide, please. So with the importance of the interconnection process in mind, what exactly are interconnection procedures and what do they do? Interconnection procedures, which sometimes are called procedures, sometimes they're called rules, sometimes they're called tariffs, depending on the state and jurisdiction. Whatever they're called, they're essentially the rules of the road for how to navigate the process of submitting an interconnection application, undergoing the technical review process associated with that, obtaining an interconnection agreement, and then ultimately completing construction and being given permission to operate. Just to keep everybody on their toes, though, there's not just one set of interconnection procedures. Rather, there are probably upwards of 100 different interconnection procedures in this country. First, there are two main tiers of procedures, essentially. There are interconnection procedures that are governed by FERC, and then there are the procedures that are adopted by states and/or individual utilities. Which set of these procedures a project needs to follow is quite complex in some cases, and is also undergoing some rapid changes as well as FERC starts to allow distributed energy resources to participate in wholesale markets. When it comes to projects that are state jurisdictional, roughly 80% of states have adopted some form of statewide interconnection procedures. Sometimes those procedures apply to every utility in the state, but more commonly, they govern only the investor-owned utilities in the states. Munis and co-ops may have their own procedures. They may voluntarily follow the state procedures, or they may not have any procedures at all. And in some states, there are really no clear procedures whatsoever. Next slide, please. At their core, the central function of the interconnection procedures is to ensure that all equipment that's interconnected to the grid is done in a safe and reliable manner, ensuring that each system will operate in a manner that protects the safety of line workers and those that interact with the grid. They also ensure that the grid can operate within appropriate thresholds for factors such as voltage, frequency, and other aspects of power quality to ensure that the power that flows on the grid to customers is of high quality. Embedded in this safety and reliability review, however, are rules regarding how much the review process should cost, who is responsible for what aspects of the review process, and any cost associated with the upgrades themselves that may be needed to accommodate a project. And finally, the rules also lay out how long the process should take, establishing timelines for both interconnection customers and the utility. Together, the goal of the rules is to ensure that the safety and reliability can be maintained, but that review process is done in an efficient and cost-effective manner. But as already noted, in order to ensure this core function, the rules also need to adapt to the changing realities in the market and on the grid itself. And thus there's increasing pressure for the interconnection rules or procedures to more actively consider how to support the rapid evolution towards a carbon-free grid and with many more distributed energy resources. One primary example of this that we're really going to get into today is that I would say that at least half of the interconnection procedures in the country today do not actually mention the words energy storage and have not yet given any consideration to how projects with energy storage's unique capabilities have or should be reviewed. Next slide, please. Okay, so what exactly is the process? Despite having hundreds of interconnection procedures that exist in the country, the good news is that most of them follow a pretty consistent framework in terms of the core elements of the review process. There are essentially two main pathways in most interconnection procedures. The first is a screening process, whereby a simple set of screens are applied to a project to determine whether the project may have impacts on the grid and either require further study to determine if upgrades are needed or to identify that upgrades are needed. This screening process is commonly broken into two sub-processes. The first is what we call the initial review, or typically called the fast track screens, and a supplemental review process. And that supplemental review process is used if one or more of those initial screens is failed. For the most part, the initial review screens were originally drafted over 20 years ago and have undergone literally almost no evolution since that time, despite rapid evolution in both the technologies connecting to the grid, for example, energy storage, and the information and capabilities that utilities have with respect to the grid. So those screens are well established at this point, but also maybe not greatly suited for the current realities of distributed energy resource interconnection. The second core component of the process, actually, I should say, the screening process is not eligible. Typically, not all projects can go through that process. Usually there's a size limit of some sort that's applied to that screening process. And if projects fail those screens, they are then sent into a core study process. Or if you're not eligible, you go straight into the study process. The screening process is almost always much, much faster than the study process. So the study process, again, varies by state and by jurisdiction. This can consist of a series of 3 different studies: a feasibility study, a system impact study, and a facilities study. Some states have consolidated that just into 2 studies, and some states conduct one combined study that covers all aspects of the review. The study is a much more intensive review than the screens. It involves actual power flow modeling of the grid to evaluate potential impacts to the grid. And then if impacts are identified, a process to identify what upgrades may be needed to remedy the issues identified, and then what those upgrades will cost. Some procedures allow for projects to propose limited changes to their project to mitigate those impacts instead of having grid upgrades required, but that's not allowed in most places and is an area of sort of evolution that we'll talk about later in the batteries project. Finally, once the review process is complete, whether a project successfully passes through the screening process or goes through study, a project can obtain an interconnection agreement and proceed for paying for upgrades if they were needed, and hopefully finally going through an inspection process and getting approval to interconnect and or turn on the project. Next slide, please. As my comments have highlighted already, there's a lot of complexity embedded in the interconnection process. In some ways, interconnection is often viewed as a simply technical review, but in reality, it's far from that. Throughout the entire process, there are many policy choices being made. Even where there are technical questions, there can be a lot of different ways of addressing a technical question, different ways of resolving both like an actual grid issue or getting to identification of that issue. And there's a lot of questions and sort of dynamic around what the different risk thresholds should be. And so at its core, there are a lot of different elements that touch on policy choices that the regulator must decide and or the utilities and the stakeholders involved in dialogue. The top row on this slide are really the three core elements of the process. The first are the procedures themselves, which outline the exact steps in the process. In the procedures, there are numerous policy elements regarding how long the process should take, what the costs are in terms of the initial application costs, study costs, and then how the utility should manage the review process, especially when you start to look to having lots of projects applying for interconnection at the same time. The next element are the technical requirements. And there's considerable variation across the country in how much detail and where these technical requirements reside. Some state interconnection procedures contain robust technical specifications in the procedures themselves. Some states have separate freestanding technical requirements documents that are adopted by the state, and others have very little in the way of specificity in the interconnection procedures or no technical requirements document adopted by the state, and either rely on utility interconnection manuals, or there may be nothing concrete in writing at all regarding the specific technical requirements. But underlying all of this is a general adherence to the core interconnection standards that are adopted by IEEE and other standards bodies such as UL and the National Electric Code. Most procedures do reference and adhere to the IEEE 1547 standards, though they may refer to old versions of that or the most current and updated version. And we'll talk a lot more about that today. The next element in the top row is the cost allocation. Interconnection procedures across the country, including those adopted by FERC and by states, generally use what's called the cost causer rule to determine who's responsible for interconnection costs. I like to actually call it the cost triggerer rule, because what that rule does is basically assign costs for any upgrades to the first project that triggers the need for an upgrade. That project must pay the entire cost of the interconnection upgrade, even though projects that came before it may have contributed to the need for the upgrade. And even though load customers, as well as additional interconnection customers who are on the grid after that upgrade is made, may also benefit from those upgrades. So currently, that's the rule almost entirely across the country. And that's one of the areas that I think is undergoing the greatest pressure these days. As we start to get higher and higher penetration of DERs on the grid, and we also have lots of different types of DERs. So we have those that are load, as well as those that are generation, and some that are both in the case of energy storage. There's the cost causer concept becomes a lot more fluid. And there's also just a lot of need to sort of look at whether it makes sense for individual projects who trigger the upgrade to bear the full cost of the upgrade. This is especially true as we start to see higher and higher upgrade costs being triggered, so larger pieces of equipment that need to be replaced, where an individual interconnection customer may not be able to bear the full cost of that interconnection, but if those costs were spread more equitably across other interconnection customers and maybe also load customers or ratepayers, that upgrade might be able to be enabled. So this is an area where a lot of states are starting to look at some changes or evolution to that default cost causer rule. The next layer of elements on this slide are other areas where you're seeing a lot of evolution as we start to have more pressure on the interconnection process and a lot of technology evolution. So the first one is grid transparency. When interconnection procedures started to be adopted for distribution interconnection back in the early 2000s, there was very little ability to learn anything about the distribution grid at the point a project wanted to interconnect at. That has evolved. Most states have something called a pre-application report where you can request information from the utility about the grid at your potential point of interconnection for a fee. And a lot of states are also starting to adopt something known as hosting capacity analyses and their associated maps. There are also increasing need for public queues to be published, so you can see what projects ahead of you are doing and how that process is going. And all of these issues about potentially sharing additional information about the grid with the public or potential interconnection customers raise some interesting dilemmas around potential grid security concerns. So this is an area of huge evolution. The batteries project touches on why that grid transparency is particularly important for energy storage projects, because they have an enormous amount of flexibility and can actually try to pick locations and design a project for the exact conditions on the grid, which solar projects in the past were able to do to some extent, but have a lot more ability to do when coupled with storage. The next element is accountability for the interconnection process itself. So as I've noted, interconnection procedures typically, and if they're good, involve identify timelines for each step in the interconnection process. And those timelines apply both to the interconnection customer and to the utility. But there very often is very little visibility into how the interconnection process is actually going in practice in terms of public reporting on how long those steps are actually taking versus what the rules require them to. And then even more rare is actual accountability for adherence to those timelines that are set forth in the procedures. States are starting to look at this both by requiring greater transparency about how the process is going through public interconnection queues or reporting, and looking at ways to incentivize and or penalize utilities who don't adhere to the timelines. There are already built into interconnection procedures penalties essentially for interconnection customers if they don't comply with the timelines. Typically, a utility, if you don't meet the timeline, utility has the ability to pull the project from the interconnection queue, resulting in them losing their place in line and their potential reservation of system capacity. There's still a lot of need for evolution in exactly how to design incentives and penalties for the interconnection process. We've seen a couple different methods used, either some individual tracking of specific timelines, look at a holistic start to end process, or other more subtle ways by looking at the overall customer experience as you would with traditional customer service metrics. And then the last element is sort of highlighting where things are going with interconnection. Interconnection, as I've noted, really focuses on projects on individual project by project basis. So every single solar and energy storage project that wants to interconnect goes through an individualized review, and the upgrades are assigned through that cost-causer rule approach. As we start to see many more DERs and a lot of interest in massive electrification of buildings and transportation, there's an increasing perception that we need to evolve the interconnection process to be more integrated with the distribution planning process, and potentially looking towards proactively upgrading the grid to accommodate projects versus only upgrading it as individual projects trigger the need for an upgrade. That more holistic approach through a distribution system planning framework can also address some of the cost allocation elements that I highlighted, and can help actually think about the interaction between DERs that are load as well as generation, and what the distribution grid needs to look like going forward. So that is a very high level introduction to what interconnection policy is overall. And now we're going to get into some of the interconnection challenges. And I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Brian Leidig, for this next element. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sky. This is Brian Leidig, Chief Regulatory Engineer with IREC. I've been here for about 5 years working on regulatory issues, with gearing towards the technical side of things, but of course working with Sky and her team across all processes. And let's review some of the big picture challenges that all parties face in this interconnection policy space. Next slide, please. We'll discuss a few different overarching issues that combine to create challenges for utilities processing interconnection applications and evaluating distribution system impacts of DERs, which create frustration on the part of developers due to uncertainty, and then leave the Public Utility Commission searching for answers on how the interconnection process can be improved. Next slide. First off, poorly designed interconnection procedures can slow or halt DER deployment. The current process of reviewing one project at a time can't keep pace with DER market growth, especially for large projects that go through lengthy reviews. They can sit in the queue for long periods. After a lengthy and expensive review, they might find that interconnection costs are too high, or the project parameters may have changed over time such that the only way to alter the project is to withdraw and resubmit, potentially losing their place in the queue and having to restart that lengthy, expensive process. Meanwhile, other projects may be sitting in the queue waiting to be studied, uncertain if the projects before them will affect their ability to interconnect. If there's not enough information available up front, such as detailed pre-application reports or hosting capacity maps, which can let the developer know beforehand if there's a possibility of feasibly interconnecting, then the interconnection process becomes a game of throwing darts while blindfolded, basically. In order to not make matters worse, it's necessary to have an efficient, faster process for the thousands of smaller systems or projects that apply. However, the existing fast-track processes, which are supposed to do just that, are starting to bump up against their limits of usefulness as we get to higher DER penetration, as Sky mentioned. Since the screens used are simplistic and conservative, they can leave a lot of capacity on the table or force unreasonable upgrade costs on the smaller projects, and larger projects can take up a significant amount of available hosting capacity on a feeder, leaving a small system, which could be the last drop that makes the cup run over, triggering large upgrade needs and costs far beyond the ability of that small project to cover. So that cost causer pays concept can make it challenging to increase hosting capacity. Even if upgrades aren't required, it can be challenging to take full advantage of the hosting capacity that remains on a feeder after the aggregate DER nameplate ratings equal the minimum load, since a small project wouldn't be able to pay for a full study if it fails out of fast track. Right? Existing interconnection rules are being stressed in a number of ways by the things I just mentioned, as well as others. Ideas are for overcoming these issues may be available or not, but it requires investigation and the PUC instituting a proceeding for the interconnection rules in order to explore what can be done. And this process may not be done all that often, and the process itself can take quite a while to reach any kind of consensus and move forward with an order. IREC's been involved in interconnection rule updates recently that took 2 years or more from start of activities to the final order. And I think we've seen worse than that. We're trying to some extent to get ahead of issues before they arise, but in many states, issues have already arisen and fixes through the interconnection rules then lag far behind that. Next slide. Finally, these challenges are happening all across the country. Some states may be the first to act on a particular issue, and they find themselves needing to innovate without much guidance from other places. Compounding that problem is that many of these issues not only require regulatory expertise, but they're technical in nature as well. So engineering guidance is needed, and it can be challenging for stakeholders and PUCs, especially to engage engineering experts depending on their resources. Many interconnection-related DER issues have a fairly small pool of experts in the country, so it's hard to find them, hard for those experts to be present or active in every PUC proceeding. But where best practices exist and have been vetted elsewhere, it's fairly easy for a commission to take up that practice. However, more and more, as the pace of DER technical evolution and deployment accelerates, we're seeing issues that don't yet have established best practices. Lag time of the many regulatory activities makes it challenging to quickly adopt new ideas across the country. All from me. Off to Radina now.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what the challenges are. Sky did touch on what some of the solutions are, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on solutions now. There are my slides not advancing. There we go. So this is not intended to be the complete list of all solutions to the challenges that we've discussed so far today. This is a highlight, and these are what I would characterize as broad buckets of solutions, both technical and procedural, and all of them policy-based. And I'm going to go clockwise here, beginning with streamlined screening and study processes that continue to support safety and reliability. As Sky mentioned, the review process after an applicant submits an interconnection application can vary from relatively speedy for small projects in some states to very intensive for projects that require more in-depth study, both intensive in terms of time and in terms of resources. And it's incredibly important. This is one of the key elements of interconnection, is to balance between the critical need to continue the safe and reliable operation of the grid with maximizing the cost and time efficiency of the review process. This is essential to getting more DERs onto the grid to enable states to achieve their clean energy goals and to build out that clean distributed energy future. Next is more fair cost allocation. Sky touched on this as well. And here the question is, when grid upgrades become necessary due to low hosting capacity or no hosting capacity, who pays for those grid upgrades? And the current model in most states of requiring the triggering interconnection applicant to pay the full cost of the upgrades is unfair, in that in a lot of instances, subsequent DER projects that interconnect at the same location may benefit from those upgrades, and those upgrades may have broader system, environmental, or ratepayer benefits. And so a number of states are considering different models to cost allocation to recognize those benefits that go beyond just that one initial applicant. So this is a very hot topic at the moment. Next is, how do we speed up the process? So it goes a little bit back to that question of streamlining the review process. Instead of studying each individual interconnection application at a time, one at a time, you group or cluster together several DER interconnection projects that are seeking to interconnect at the same location of the grid. You study them together and you allocate costs on a pro rata basis, depending on how much hosting capacity each project is using. I'm just describing this in very general terms. And as with cost allocation, several states are looking at the group or cluster study process. The terminology differs depending on where you are, and also from distribution and transmission perspectives. So also another hot topic and potential solution. It's also critically important to make sure that interconnection procedures include the latest technical standards. My colleague Midhat is going to be speaking more about this in the next segment, so I'm going to skip over this pretty quickly. And last but not least are two somewhat interrelated issues. We want to, as cost effectively as possible, increase the available hosting capacity. And as part of that, that can involve allowing projects to modify their design while undergoing review in the interconnection process without having that project be bumped off the queue or having to go back to the end, or rather the start of the queue. So these are interrelated in that allowing projects to redesign in the midst of the interconnection process could allow them to mitigate or avoid the need for grid upgrades and thus avoid further hosting capacity constraints. And the way that these solutions are implemented in states might differ a little bit if you are in an early stage state versus a late stage state. We're using these terms very broadly. Some states fall in between, but the general distinction is states where you have DER markets that are just now starting, those are early stage, versus states that have very developed DER markets and are facing major hosting capacity constraints, those are late stage states. And for both, early stage and late stage, you want well-designed interconnection procedures that are streamlined, transparent, fair, and efficient. And you want the latest technical requirements, and you want cost allocation mechanisms that provide that more fair cost allocation. And for late stage states, you want all of that, plus getting to that more future looking model of holistic planning that Skye mentioned earlier, where you are more proactively incorporating DER that includes electrification onto the grid, with the aim being to reduce the time and cost of interconnection and support the more rapid and cost-effective integration of DERs. And now I will hand it off to Midhat. Midhat, take it away.
Hello, everyone. My name is Midhat Mafazi. I'm an engineer with IREC, and I'm excited to be sharing some of the work IREC and partners have been working on this. For the next couple slides, we'll walk you through some of the unique considerations for storage assets. Next slide. It is important to highlight what makes storage a unique asset on the grid. As an asset, storage differs from solar and wind. Storage can be deployed under a variety of operating profiles and use cases. DERs such as solar and wind operates during certain times of the day and can have seasonal variations. Storage is unique in that it can provide or consume power at any time and may be designed to operate on a schedule or to respond to dynamic signal for many different reasons. It could be for self-consumption, rate schedule, market participation, or distribution investment deferral. Storage can also serve as both generation and load, either discharging to or charging from the grid. If paired with on-site generation like solar, it can also charge from that source. Storage can mitigate the variability and intermittency of renewables. And finally, perhaps the single most important attribute of storage, whether it is installed alone or co-located with another DER, is that it offers a level of control that is often not utilized by other DERs. At any one time, storage can control how much power is exported or imported to the grid. It can act as a purely non-exporting resource, a full export resource, or a limited export resource that limits export to a specified magnitude. If you think about it some more, storage may be able to limit export during periods of low demands and instead ramp up export during period of peak demands. If properly evaluated in screens and studies, such control flexibility can better serve energy needs while also allowing more DERs to interconnect without triggering the need for upgrades. These operating capabilities make storage valuable asset and also introduces complexities in the interconnection process. Next slide. One of the biggest challenges with storage is that most interconnection procedures don't expressly address storage and its capabilities. Interconnection rules or even related documents like application forms and agreements do not capture the uniqueness of storage. This lack of inclusion creates a lot of challenges. Take, for instance, interconnection analysis. Many projects are studied in a manner that assumes it can export or import its full capacity at any time, with little to no account for hourly, daily, or seasonal variations. Another key challenge is that there is lack of standardized controls that enable limited and non-exporting systems in interconnection procedures. Standardized controls such as the use of certified power control systems, PCS, or utility-grade relays provide a means to streamline applications. If controls are not standardized, each application will continue to face customized reviews, and reviews will assume storage can export full capacity all the time. And this builds into the last point there, lack of trust. The toolkit recognizes that utilities need to be able to trust that storage assets will operate as agreed upon. Chapter 3 of the toolkit recognizes 6 acceptable export control methods that should be integrated into the interconnection rules to avoid the need of customized reviews and analysis. I think we can all agree that non-standard types of export control equipment will continue to need customized review. However, interconnection procedures should be updated to identify a list of acceptable methods that can be trusted and relied upon by both the customer and the utility. Next slide. Now we would like to transition to standards. Chapter 8 of the toolkit takes a deeper look at the whole issue with incorporating updated standards into the interconnection rules. The chapter looks at IEEE 1547 series of standards, which is the DR interconnection standards, as we mentioned earlier, and also the UL 1741 and its CRD. For the next couple of slides, we'll talk a little more on the IEEE 1547 and some key consideration and tools that are available to you. The revised 1547 was published in 2018 and conformance test came out in 2020. UL 1741 was updated in 2021 and products are expected to be available in 2023. Many states had earlier signaled this year to require adoption, but have now shifted to around April of next year. Each state is going to need to determine timeline for implementation. Picking the implementation date is important, but there are other elements of this that you need to consider. Second, you also need to consider where the technical requirements will reside. This was mentioned earlier. This is an important decision to make and one that will have an impact on the adoption process. Should all the 1547 requirements go into the rule, or should the rule only specify high-level 1547 requirements and then possibly have a separate document with more details on things like default settings from inverters? Category assignment is also important. For the most part, this is straightforward. At high level, there are 2 decisions to make. That is the selection of normal performance categories, which can be A or B, and the selection of abnormal performance right through categories, which can be 1, 2, or 3. Another key decision point is, are you going to define default functions and settings? And will you be using 1547 defaults or define your own? Same thing with voltage regulation impacts, volt-var and volt-watt. Are they activated, not activated? If activated, are you going to use 1547 defaults or using your own specified defaults? With voltage regulation, you also got to be careful on that selection process. Keep in mind the default for 1547 is to use constant power factor of 1, so no reactive power, no voltage support. Then there is the process update. You will need a process in place for when and how to update default settings, which may need to be adjusted over time. Similarly, interconnection agreements may need to be updated to reflect agreed upon operating criteria and contractual obligations. Interconnection screens and study need to be updated to reflect updated standards. Batteries touches on this, which is a good starting point, but there are other elements you may want to go beyond what batteries did, especially if default voltage regulation is activated. Finally, communications deployment, which is still nascent and best practices are still in development. 1547 devices will be capable of communicating, but how do you want to utilize it? Would you need a roadmap plan? If deployed, you may need to consider the need to change the interconnection rules telemetry requirement for DR size thresholds. Next slide. For this slide, we just wanted to share a snapshot of a key resource that IREC will have available to assist and guide in the 1547 adoption. What you are seeing on the screen is what we call a decision option matrix for adopting 1547. The matrix complements many of the available resources, including from batteries, and translate them into something that PUC staff, utilities, and other stakeholders can use to keep track of the key items that need to be decided on before adopting 1547. Quite simply, it provides a checklist that walks you through each topic, what the issue is at hand, its justification, what decisions are available to you, and most important, it can be customized for individual states. The matrix is color-coded as shown in the key at the top and highlights with appropriate colors for things that can go into the rule as shown in yellow, things that can go in the rule or technical documents, TIR, which is colored in peach, or things that are designated as other, which can go either way and colored in green. The matrix is also divided into three categories. There is the near-term items, which are portrayed in gray in the table. Then there is the mid-term and long-term decision that should be made, which are farther down the matrix and you can't see from the screen. Overall, the matrix has close to 30 number decisions that need to be made, ranging from adoption timeline, category assignments, voltage regulation, to communication deployments. Next slide, and I'll turn it to Mari.
Great, thanks, Midhat. Hi, everyone. My name is Mari Hernandez. I'm with IREC. I'm the Assistant Director of the Regulatory Program. I'm just going to go through really quickly some of our upcoming toolkit training and education options. So as Radina mentioned at the outset, during this third and final year of the grant, we're focused on providing outreach and trainings related to the toolkit we released in March of this year. So we'll hold a series of workshops and trainings to ensure that folks understand the energy storage interconnection challenges we've identified in the toolkit, and also are able to use the tools that we've identified to address those challenges, particularly at the state regulatory level. Next slide, please. So these are the 8 topics that we'll cover in our workshops and trainings. I'm actually not going to go through each of them since we've already gone through a lot of them throughout the presentation already, but I do just want to note that each training is not going to attempt to cover all of them. We're going to break this up into easier to digest chunks of them. So next slide. So if you haven't yet looked through our lengthy toolkit, a couple of our major objectives were that the solutions would have wide applicability across the country and be easy to use. So to that end, we used FERC's small generator interconnection procedures as a starting point, since many states have used SGEP in their rules already. So these recommendations and the model language we provide in the toolkit can be used by stakeholders in regulatory proceedings and working groups. And Radina mentioned this also, we do recognize that not all states and jurisdictions are experiencing the same level of DER penetration, and not all utilities are working with the same budget or number of staff. So we just want to note that states will need to determine what makes sense for their jurisdictions, and at the very least can start with ensuring that storage is included in interconnection rules and consider adopting language that would enable export controlled systems. Next slide, please. So over the coming months, we'll be holding 4 workshops and 7 additional trainings. This slide just shows how we're breaking up the different trainings over the next several months. We're starting with grid transparency, then technical standards, storage flexibility, which will combine a few of the topics from the toolkit, and scheduling. We'll be holding 1 workshop and at least 1 training for each topic. The workshops will be interactive, similar to this, but we're going into a breakout group and we'll be asking for feedback in each of the workshops to help us design the trainings to ensure that they're useful and give participants the information they need to implement the solutions in the toolkit. Because the storage flexibility theme will cover multiple topics, we'll be holding multiple trainings and breaking them out by different audiences. So 1 for utilities, 1 for regulatory staff, for regulators, and 1 for DER advocates. And then we're finalizing the dates for those now, and we'll be sharing those soon. So stay tuned for updates on that. We'd love for you all to participate. And then we're also going to be presenting on the toolkit at RE Plus in September and hopefully other events. Next slide, please. So please reach out to us if you have any questions that we aren't able to answer here today or in the breakout groups. We're about to go into breakout rooms for further discussion and questions. Before we do that, we have 1 other poll. Michelle, can you launch that poll now?
And just so folks understand, this is Radina, the reason we're asking this question is because, as Bari mentioned, we're going to be doing a pretty intensive training and education rollout for the remainder of this year into March of next year. And we definitely want to tailor the content of those trainings. They're obviously all going to be focused on what is provided as solutions in the toolkit, but we want to make sure that we tailor them as much as possible to the interests and needs of folks who participate. And so knowing how you engage with interconnection, whether it's through direct regulatory work or other means, I think could be very helpful for us in determining what focus to take during those trainings. So let's leave this up for another 30 seconds or so, and we can then transition into the breakout groups. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I believe everyone will automatically be placed into a breakout group. You may need to click accept to go there, and then we will all come back together. We'll be brought back together automatically at the end. All right. Thank you.